When the Spanish first walk into Tenochtitlan, one of Cortez's soldiers stands before a wall that is not made of stone. It is made of skulls. They are threaded in their thousands through wooden beams, pierced through the temples, stacked in towers the height of a man and taller. His name, in some tellings, is Andrés de Tapia. He does not count the dead one by one. He counts the posts and the heads strung on each, and he multiplies 5 skulls to a beam, beam after beam, and reaches for a number large enough to hold his horror. He will write later that there were 136,000. He will not be believed. For 4 centuries, the world will decide he was lying. Now move forward 500 years, almost to the season. A street in central Mexico City, a few steps from the Metropolitan Cathedral. A trowel scrapes through wet earth beneath a colonial building, and it stops against something pale and curved and unmistakable. Bone, and then another, and then more than anyone is ready to find. For most of those 400 years, the skull racks of Tenochtitlan lived only in the chronicles of the men who destroyed the city. Tapia, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the friar Bernardino de Sahagún, who gathered Mexica testimony but filtered it through his own faith. They described a structure they called the Tzompantli, a place where the heads of the sacrificed were displayed in their hundreds and their thousands, and the more comfortable the centuries became, the easier it was to assume the conquerors had simply lied. It made sense after all. The Spanish had every reason to exaggerate. A civilization drowning in blood is a civilization that deserves conquering. A people that murders on that scale is a people you are doing a favor by erasing. The numbers, the towers, the rivers of the dead, all of it began to look like propaganda, written backward to justify what had already been done. By the 20th century, many serious scholars treated the Great Skull Rack as a kind of dark legend. A story told by victors, a thing that had grown in the telling until it could not possibly have been real. And then, in 2015, it became real. Beneath a building at number 24 on the street called República de Guatemala, the archaeologists of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, the INAH, began to dig. Their urban archaeology program, led by Raúl Barrera Rodríguez, had spent years recovering Tenochtitlan one fragment at a time, working in the cramped flooded basements of a living city. What they uncovered here was without precedent, a platform set with rows of circular holes, 25 centimeters across, spaced evenly apart where the wooden posts had once stood. And at its edge, rising from the floor of the old sacred precinct, a tower. Not a tower decorated with skulls, a tower built of them. Hundreds of crania set into mortar of lime and clay, arranged in concentric rings, some faces turned outward, some turned in toward a hollow center, built in stages, layer upon layer, across the last decades before the conquest. To date, the team has recovered 665 skulls, bound up in nearly 11,000 fragments of bone. The legend had a floor, it had walls, it had a body count that no longer needed a conquistador to vouch for it. The structure was real, but the bones did not say what everyone expected them to say. The story everyone carried, conqueror and scholar alike, was a story of warriors, captured fighters, young men taken in battle, their heads claimed as the trophies of a war machine. That is what the Tzompantli was supposed to be. A wall of defeated enemies, Then the physical anthropologists went to work. A team coordinated by Jorge Gómez-Valdés with Field Chief Lorena Vázquez Vallín cleaned and stabilized a sample of the crania and read them the way you read a life. The robustness of the bone, the shape of the brow, the markers written into the skull by years and sex and childhood, and the simple wall of captured enemy warriors broke apart. Of the skulls studied so far, roughly 46% were male, and more than 37% were female. The rest could not be sexed, some too damaged to read, and some because they were children, women, children, standing in the same towers, set in the same lime, given the same place in the same sacred structure as any captured soldier. Some of the women may themselves have been captives, or even fighters. The children, perhaps, chosen as living images of a newborn god. Whatever this was, it was never only a battlefield trophy case. The simplest story, the one that let everyone sleep, was wrong. So we have to do the harder thing. We have to try to stand inside the world that built this and see it as they saw it. For the Mexica, the universe was not given freely. It was kept alive by debt. The sun that rose each morning had been made by gods who threw themselves into fire, and it moved across the sky only because it was fed. Blood was not horror. Blood was reciprocity, the price of dawn, the rent paid on existence itself. The sacrificed were not garbage to be discarded. They were offerings and and often something more. Barrera Rodríguez has said it plainly. The dead of the Tzompantli were made sacred. Some were treated as gifts to the gods, some as the living presence of the gods themselves. And the structure was not, in their minds, a monument to death. It was, he says, a temple that generated life. The Mexica buried bone the way a farmer buries maize. The skull was a seed. You sow the dead, and from them you harvest the living. And the world turns over once more. A woman, a child, a captured warrior, each could become part of that turning. On their own terms, this was not madness. It was devotion, ordered and literate and exact, carried out by a civilization that had thought carefully about why the universe demanded so much and had decided to pay. Here is where the truth doubles back on itself. The structure was real. The Spanish did not invent the tower, but understand what they did with it. They took a thing the Mexica held as sacred reciprocity, the feeding of the sun, the sowing of seed, and they recast it as proof of a people too monstrous to be allowed to exist. They inflated it. 136,000, Tapia's number, a tally no excavation has ever come near, repeated for centuries as if it were a measurement instead of a weapon. They needed the Mexica to be monsters, because monsters can be conquered without guilt, baptized at sword point, worked to death in mines, erased. So we inherited a lie wrapped around a truth. The truth was the bone. The lie was the meaning forced onto it, and for 400 years we got it exactly backward. Dismissing the real thing as exaggeration while swallowing whole the propaganda built on top of it. The dig did not vindicate the conquistadors. It convicted them twice, once for what they destroyed, and once for the story they told, to make the destroying feel like mercy. So look again at the tower. Not at savages, at a civilization, bureaucratic, devout, literate in the stars, a people who looked at a frightening universe and built an entire moral order to explain why suffering was necessary, and then carried that order out with care and called it holy. You have done this. Your nation has done this. Every flag that ever sent its young to die for a cause. Every faith that promised the dead were not wasted. Every empire that called its slaughter civilization. every fear that told you some people simply had to be removed for the world to stay safe. They were not aliens. They were a people convinced, as you are convinced, that their violence meant something, that it kept the sun in the sky. They counted their dead and called it devotion. We count ours and call it defense. The skull tower, they said, was a lie, was real all along. The lie was only ever the comfort of believing that the people who built it were nothing like us. They were us. They are still us. And the sun comes up either way.